I'm going to, I just pressed record again. Okay, great. So welcome everybody. We are just really, really honored that Gregg Bordowitz is here with us today to have this conversation. Gregg, your work personally to me and for so many of us has just shaped all of our thinking and our lives and our organizing. So just, it's incredible to get to be here with you.
Thank you.
A few logistics first, and then I'll say a few words about JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, and say a few words about Gregg, and then Gregg and I will open up into a conversation. So a couple of logistics. So everyone's going to be on mute for this conversation, and so you can just take this as an opportunity just to chill out. You know what I mean? Like participate, be here, but also make yourself comfortable. We have these new lives where we're like in the screen all the time. So just maybe all together we can just go ahead and stretch for a moment. Just remind yourself you have a human body. You can stretch in any direction you want to stretch. Whatever you're wearing is perfect. You look amazing. Good. And just go ahead and just make yourself comfortable. If you want to have a little bit of water or whatever you're drinking, really just make yourself comfortable for this conversation. I can think of no better reason to put on a shirt. And just so I'm so glad we get to be here. So we will be muted. The chat box is open, so you're welcome to, as the conversation flows, to put in questions. I also encourage you to mostly just be present. And you know, sometimes with this Zoom thing, we're like so focused on this like two conversations at once. So yes, put in questions as our time goes on, and also I invite you just to kind of just be present and get to just be in this conversation. A couple other logistics. As we all know, Zoom, like all of our other places of gathering, is not susceptible to right-wing reactionary violence. So we will be on all mute, so there won't be any kind of like verbal Zoom bombers, but in the case that there is anything hateful on the visual screen or in the chat box, we're gonna remove that participant. So in case there's any kind of racist, misogynist, transphobic, xenophobic, any kind of hateful anything, we will remove that person. What else? I think those are my logistics. Okay, so I'll say a few things and then we'll open up the conversation with Gregg. So I feel nervous. I feel really nervous and excited for this conversation, and it feels like this conversation, doing all this over Zoom, organizing in this moment, is all of us entering into this space of unknown. So I'm just inviting myself, I'm inviting you all, I'm inviting Gregg even to be in the unknown, that we're not even looking to Gregg to give us the solutions or the answers. We're not looking to those of you who joined us today to have the answers. I'm reminding myself I don't have to have the answers, but we get to be here in our commitment to moving through this crisis together towards justice and being in the unknown. So like all of you, many of us are sitting in mourning already at those who we have lost in our extended families to COVID-19. Many of us are sick with the virus right now on this call, and all of us have been impacted by countless ways already. So economic hardship, fear for friends and family, the pain of isolation, and the profound impact this crisis is having on healthcare workers, emergency workers, our friends and family who are incarcerated, and essential workers who we know have been essential all along, who have been abandoned and neglected by our local, state, and federal governments. To all of you, we just want to say a deep welcome, exactly as you are today, exactly as you're feeling today, physically, emotionally. If you're feeling hopeful, if you're feeling desperate, if you're feeling shitty, if you're feeling wonderful, welcome. We need you exactly as you are. For those who are not yet familiar with Jewish Voice for Peace, I'll say a few words about our work. We were founded in 1996 out of a very simple belief that Palestinians, like all people, deserve freedom and dignity. That's really the guiding compass of our work, that Palestinian people, like all people, deserve freedom and dignity. And we were a national membership organization and with chapters across the country, including our wonderful New York City chapter. And we work to support people in the Palestinian diaspora in their struggle for justice and the right to return to their homeland. Specifically from our seat as Jews here in the US, we work to challenge oppressive US foreign policy, such as the outlandish US military aid to Israel. We challenge Islamophobia in our own communities, and we challenge the ways in which the accusation of anti-Semitism has been used to demonize Palestinians, Muslims, and supporters of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. In this Trumpian moment of heightened actual anti-Semitism and heightened actual Islamophobia and anti-black racism and xenophobia and transphobia and trans misogyny and anti-Asian racism and more, we believe as strongly as we ever did that safety comes through solidarity, not through racism, not through militarism, not through policing, not through borders, and not through imprisonment. So we're here today out of that commitment that safety comes through solidarity. And in this moment of the COVID-19 pandemic, JVP New York City is working to support those who are being most impacted by this crisis. So particularly people in prisons, jails, and detention centers, people under occupation and siege in Gaza, tenants and healthcare workers. We just released a platform of how we're approaching this pandemic. You can read it. Maybe Elena can put it in the chat. And our work has always taught us to organize across barriers. Our work in international solidarity, in prison solidarity, has always taught us that we must organize across the walls, the borders, the fences that the systems of oppression create. And we're going to take one very specific collective form of action right now on this call to remind ourselves that we are not powerless. And what we're going to do together is we're going to try our best to bail someone out of Rikers jail right now. And what we know is that Rikers has 80% times the rate of infection of COVID-19 as the rest of the country, and has always been a public health crisis and is now more so than ever. And we know that that means mass death and infection for the largely Black and brown people who are incarcerated at Rikers. So as part of our efforts to be in solidarity across borders and walls, there's a wonderful campaign called the COVID-19 Bailout Campaign. And they let us know that it is, it costs about $3,500 to bail somebody out right now. And so we want to start this conversation with Gregg about solidarity, about taking care of one another, about about mutual aid. We want to start that with doing our best to try to raise as much money as we can in this call. So what I want to invite us to do before we go much further, and this is if you have $1 and if you have $100, if you have more, we're going to invite you to make a donation right now to the COVID Bailout NYC campaign. And so on Venmo, you can open up your Venmo, and Layla, maybe you can put this in the chat. It's COVID Bailout NYC. And what we're going to invite folks to do right now is to actually put in the chat how much you're able to donate right now. And if you can't donate right now, how much you hope to be able to donate at some point. And then we're just going to kind of keep a little tally of how much we've been able to raise on this call. So I'll just give folks a moment to open their Venmos and make a donation to COVID Bailout NYC. And then to put in the chat box how much we can just keep track of our donations. One concrete way we can be in solidarity. Does it have to be Venmo is a good question. I don't know, Layla, maybe you can look up that question and you can just put in the chat however much you would like to donate however we're able to get them that donation. Awesome, so already hearing $100, 10 right now, 20 more on Thursday, and we will figure out how to donate not on Venmo.
I can make 100 too.
COVID bailout.
Awesome.
I can't find it. Is it?
We can hear you, Greg and Christine.
Morgan, could you repeat? Is it one word or is it two words? At COVID bailout.
At COVID bailout NYC. Great. So Layla or Elena, if you could just keep track of how much this is awesome. Just so many donations are coming in from $5 to $100 to $50. So this is just wonderful. Just give a few more moments for us to do that. And again, if you don't have Venmo,
What's this?
we're going to put that in. We're going to put that in the chat, an alternative to Venmo. Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for donating. Thank you for all the work that everyone is doing to take care of ourselves, our loved ones. Is it the same as the Emergency Release Fund? Layla or Elena, if you could respond to that, that'd be great. It's a different fund, but they now the bailout has their own Venmo, but previously they were using the Emergency Release Fund's Venmo, but both are really important funds. Okay, so we just took a little action together. Thank you, and we'll keep doing that. On Friday at, I believe is it 2 to 3? Elena or Layla? JVP is also going to be hosting a phone bank to demand that, we're putting the PayPal in the chat, to demand that New York City release all people from jails, prisons, and detention centers, free them all. So that's our commitment as JVP New York City, is we're working in solidarity to release everyone who is currently in cages. And we're going to be doing a phone bank every Friday afternoon, and we'll put that information in the chat about our phone bank. You're welcome to join us. We're going to get together and call the various people who have the power to let people out and are not doing it. And we're going to also keep track of the ways in which they're saying that they are letting people out but actually aren't. So we're going to hold them to it. Beautiful. Elena just put in the chat the information, 2 to 3 phone bank on Friday, free them all for public health. Okay, thank you, everybody. And there's an email address to RSVP. So thank you, everybody, so much for doing that and for all that you're doing to show up for your loved ones, for people on the front lines. Thank you. So I'm going to turn our attention now to our beloved guest, Gregg Bordowitz. Gregg, I'm just so happy you're here. I'll say a few words about you and then we'll open up into our conversation. So Gregg is many things to many of us. A few of the things that Gregg is a native New Yorker. He's a poet. He's an artist. He's a sculptor, a video artist. He's an early member of ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. He joined when he was 22 in 1987. He is a co-founder of 2 video artist collectives that were affiliated with ACT UP, one called Testing the Limits and the other called DIVA, Damned Interfering Video Artists. He was the assistant coordinator and then the coordinator of audio-visual at the Gay Men's Health Crisis, first under Jean Carlamusto, and created incredible work of peer support and both experimental film work and also peer support, mutual aid. He's a long-term survivor of AIDS, an active member of Kolot Hayenu, which is a beloved congregation for many of us, an avid Torah reader and studier, a teacher, the director of the low-res MFA program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and I feel very honored to say a dear friend and dear mentor who has just shaped my thinking and my life in profound ways. So Gregg, so glad you're here.
Thank you so much, Morgan. It means a great deal to me to be with you, to be invited to speak with you, and to continue our ongoing rich conversation in this way. I learned very much from you through our conversation, and I'm really happy to be here with JVP and others to have a discussion. Thank you.
Not sure that I think the computer, just the last thing you said, we'll just.
Oh, I'm sorry. I said thank you so much.
Okay,
Was the last thing.
perfect. Greg and I said before this conversation, we
How
said.
much did you miss? I thanked you for so many things. Thank you for being you. I thanked you for your friendship. I thanked you for this ongoing conversation. I thank JVP for its great work. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. If you could say that just a couple more times, that would be wonderful.
Okay, great.
So Greg and I said before this conversation, we're going to try our best to have fun. So we'll try our best to do that under these absurd conditions that we're all navigating. So Greg, I want to start by actually showing a photo of one of pieces of your work, and I'm going to try my best to. We're all like suddenly have to be like at the Genius Bar, which is so annoying to me that we're all like suddenly having to be tech people. But I'm going to try to be technological and do a share screen. So this is a picture of you, Greg, under a work of art that you made in 2002. And you made it at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, for a show at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. And this picture is from its most recent installment at the Art Institute of Chicago, where your retrospective recently was, and where your retrospective of your work is going to be moving to MoMA PS1 once we're able to all be together in public again. And for those who, I'll just describe the photo. There's a big yellow banner that's hanging above the Impressionism gallery in the Art Institute of Chicago that says "The AIDS crisis is still beginning." And underneath that is Greg. So Greg, can we just start with you just telling us about this work and what it means to you, and perhaps what does it mean to be looking at it right now?
Sure. Yeah, it's surprising to see. I really love the opportunity to produce this piece at the show almost a year ago that was curated by Robin Farrell and Solveig Nelson of the Art Institute, and it was a show that was started in Portland, Oregon by the curator Stephanie Snyder, who had the idea to initiate and organize a retrospective of my work. I'm grateful to all of those curators. And the banner was also in the show in the Reed Gallery, the Cooley Gallery at Reed College, where Stephanie Snyder is the curator, and like you said, at the MCA. So this banner has been around for a really long time. This one was actually specifically made for that site, which was the grand entrance hallway of the Art Institute of Chicago. And it's above the Impressionist Gallery, which thrilled me, and also above Rodin's. And it's the first thing you see when you walk through the entranceway into the museum. It was important to me to emphasize, particularly around a retrospective, that my work is ongoing, and more importantly, that the AIDS crisis is ongoing. If future historians, if there are future historians, if we avoid catastrophe, global climate collapse, and there is a recorded history in the next couple hundred years, I think people will look back and see that the AIDS crisis was indeed still beginning. There are 36 million people with HIV around the world. Only half are getting the drugs, medications that are keeping me and many others alive. That is a huge victory for global AIDS activism, but that's only half. And things are getting worse. Even before the COVID pandemic, the bottom was falling out of global AIDS funding. There's huge discrepancies along class and geography in our own country. There's a terrible discrepancy in access to drugs between the southern United States and the northern United States, which replicates a split between the global north and the global south that continues. AIDS is one of the leading causes of death of women around the world. at present, it's still very much an urgent issue. And the challenge, I think, of putting together a retrospective that Stephanie first posed to me and that Solveig and Robin then helped me extend, was to understand that the AIDS crisis has a tremendous amount of urgency still today. But also we can look at the AIDS epidemic as a way that capitalism fails us in addressing catastrophes and crises. So you could say that we are organized rationally toward irrational ends in that we fund the military and are invested in keeping the rich rich rather than attending to the basic health needs of a majority of people on the planet, many people in this country, that the AIDS crisis and the AIDS activist movement launched a discussion on healthcare in this country. As an AIDS activist in the 80s, I really thought that AIDS activism would hopefully end the HIV epidemic, but I also had great hopes that it would bring about universal healthcare in the United States. And I think that all of the discussions that happened around healthcare, from the flawed proposals from the Clinton White House to the further development of greater access to healthcare under the Obama administration, were efforts that came out of AIDS activism. And we didn't reach the goal of universal access. But I think actually we're at this moment now of such a terrible crisis that one of the effects will be that this country, the United States, will again take a look at the way that healthcare is delivered and not delivered with any equity, and could be.
Thank you. Thanks, Greg.
So could you hear me through that? Was that?
I can hear you perfectly. I can hear you absolutely perfectly. Thank you. So just continuing along these lines of this, what that banner, I think one of the many things that that banner does is really challenges the ways in which HIV and AIDS are put in the past, and also AIDS activism is put in the past. And I think to say the AIDS crisis is still beginning, to say that it's not over, and also that AIDS activism is still very much alive in terms of addressing the HIV/AIDS pandemic, but also informing our movements. And I know us at JVP have been deeply informed by the really transformative organizing of ACT UP and so many other formations in that ecology of AIDS activists. I wonder, you started to talk about capitalism and healthcare and some of the demands that ACT UP was making. And you and I were talking last night about how important it is to, in this moment of COVID-19, this pandemic, to really, first of all, not make false, flat analogies or comparisons with HIV/AIDS, and also not to erase the history of AIDS activism and the radical internationalist demands that ACT UP and other groups were making. So underneath or nearby this banner was also two clocks, one set on the time of Chicago and one set on the time of Cape Town, to sort of show the international dynamic of this pandemic, which we're also seeing with COVID-19. So I just wonder if you can talk more about the analysis that ACT UP was making about HIV and AIDS as it was being and is being distributed along lines of white supremacy, imperialism, capitalism. Like, if you could just talk about that analysis that you all were developing as you were organizing.
ACT UP was a clearinghouse for efforts. There were large group efforts and then there were small group efforts, and we followed a molecular model of organizing. So we were organized into affinity groups. So affinity groups could bring an action to the larger floor, which could be as many as 1,000 people on a Monday night. For those of you who don't know, the ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, started in 1987, and its first meetings were held at the Lesbian and Gay LGBT Community Center. At that time, it was called the Gay and Lesbian Community Center. The acronym grew, our consciousness grew, the Gay Center on 13th Street in New York, and that could fit around 350 people. That only lasted for like a year and a half or so. The room got so full that we had to move to the Great Hall at Cooper Union, which seats 1,000 people. And those meetings for years were full. And an ACT UP meeting it was centralized. There were facilitators, and there was always a topic of discussion before the floor, which operated according to Robert's Rules of Order, which is a kind of parliamentary procedure. We decided how participatory democracy should function with such a large group of people. And then there was a lot of discussion in side rooms, on the sides. And basically the great thing about ACT UP that was different to my really youthful experiences on the left was that ACT UP was really about saying yes. And it was self-selecting. So you could stand up as someone once did and say, you know, I want to form a committee on needle exchange, which I became part of. And that was one of the great victories of ACT UP, was that me and 9 or 10 other people got arrested for distributing clean hypodermic needles on Delancey Street to injection drug users, because it was illegal in New York at that time to possess hypodermic needles, and it carried a punishment of up to a year in prison, but it was never really used for that. The cops used to hassle injection drug users if they found works on them to cruelly keep drug users in prison or in jail overnight or for 72 hours. But we actually won. It was unbelievable to us. We won what many activists want to do in court. We won the necessity decision around needle exchange, meaning that our crime was considered to be less of a crime than the crime of not distributing clean needles to injection drug users in New York City at the height of the epidemic. So, but to go back to the example, that was just like one idea that came to mind. People, you know, the thing about ACT UP was that it was all about the model of yes, and ideas carried the room, basically. Ideas were carried by how many people would commit to them. Large actions were ratified by the entire group. Affinity groups could act independently and not necessarily use the name ACT UP, but came out of ACT UP. And so it was really a clearinghouse for ideas. So the point I'm trying to get to, and stop me if I start to ramble, is that AIDS was never a single issue. That was the biggest critique that we faced from the existing left at that time, was that AIDS is a single issue and we're into coalition politics. But actually, coalition politics was at the central, coalition politics was central to AIDS activism and ACT UP, in that there was a housing committee, there was a people of color majority caucus, there was a women's caucus, it was a tremendously diverse group, and we dealt with housing, poverty, criminal justice, carceral politics, distribution of medications, basic healthcare needs. There was so many issues that we addressed, and AIDS was touched on all of the social inequity and social ills that existed in the city, the country, and the world at that time. And we had wanted to be international at scope in the beginning, but we really didn't or couldn't, because the crisis was so awful in the 80s for us in New York. And Gay Men's Health Crisis was situated in Chelsea, which was a gay neighborhood, and we were fighting a tremendous amount of homophobia, as well as racism and AIDS phobia. And really the movement quickly got overwhelmed by just addressing the crisis for ourselves, really. Gay men's health crisis was formed before ACT UP. Larry Kramer, well-known activist, was involved with starting the Gay men's health crisis. The Gay men's health crisis quickly became a nonprofit organization that dealt with very practical issues. How do you get people access to the whatever benefits are available to them? How do they navigate the social bureaucracy to get access to benefits? Where is there a welcoming place in New York City where a person who's visibly ill can go to get counseling, advice, share community? We served lunch at the Gay men's health crisis 2 times a day with over 100 people with HIV, just having lunch. Someone volunteered to play piano. That was activism. That was activism to us. We used to get bomb threats in the middle of the winter, and everyone would have to empty out the building. Like really, really sick people who had come there for community and support and to get access to and information would have to line up in the middle of the winter because we'd get bomb threats, and still everyone would go back in for lunch. That was the kind of atmosphere that we were dealing with at that time. ACT UP grows out of that because GMHC becomes a nonprofit organization, and the nonprofit status doesn't really allow it the mobility for a kind of street activism. And ACT UP was really organized for nonviolent civil disobedience and street action. And there grew a kind of competition, like one was possibly more militant than the other. I never believed that. The people I worked with never believed that. I worked at the Gay men's health crisis and was a very active member of ACT UP at the same time. I would leave my job at the Gay men's health crisis and go to a subcommittee meeting of ACT UP and then go to the main meeting on Monday nights. And I went to an ACT UP meeting every night for something or during the day. And then we had actions. And what does that have to do with COVID now? I think it presents us with a model of community response that has to be refigured, because a lot of our activism was about touch. Just being a person with HIV and AIDS and being around people who weren't afraid to touch you. This reminds a lot of people who are around those days of the really early days of the HIV epidemic, before it was even called HIV, before the virus was even identified. It was called GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, which sounds a lot like China virus. You know, it was really a kind of homophobic response and a way of pretending, the general public could pretend that HIV was not a threat, in that it focused on very specific groups that were disproportionately affected. And a lot of those divisions that were created had to do with already pre-existing divisions in society. So for example, HIV or AIDS, GRID, comes to the attention of the medical establishment by 2 very, very famous reports in the Morbidity, Mortality Weekly Report of the Centers for Disease Control. And there were 5 cases of Kaposi sarcoma, which was a very rare condition, a rare cancer that usually affected elderly people. And there were like 5 or so cases of pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. It's no longer called that. Which was also a very rare pneumonia. This appeared among a very small cohorts of self-identified homosexual men in New York and San Francisco. And those first reports said that it conjectured that this appearance of strange diseases that were not really prevalent among young people, young, healthy people, was possibly the result of some aspect of a shared lifestyle. That's a quote. That's the name of my first video, and I took it from the Morbidity, Mortality Weekly Report. Some aspect of a shared lifestyle. AIDS becomes a gay disease. There seems to be a disproportionate number of people with HIV in the Haitian community. Looking back on the same report that delivers the news to the medical establishment that there's this strange immune compromising disease out in the world that's affecting young people. It seems to be affecting homosexuals disproportionately. It was, but also there were reports of epidemic rises of tuberculosis in Harlem and in the Bronx, and different diseases in the different boroughs. If you look back now and you put it back together, you realize what was happening was that there was HIV was spreading through many, many communities through a number of routes of transmission that was disproportionately affecting socially stigmatized groups who had already been left out of the social bargain of healthcare. And that was what was rising to the visibility of epidemiological surveillance at that time, and was producing this picture. Privilege played a role. The two cases of Kaposi sarcoma and pneumocystis pneumonia, the two examples of the number of cases, had to do with people who could afford to go to doctors who then would notice these strange opportunistic infections in a specific population. But it had to do with privilege, and it had to do with the way that privilege shapes surveillance within the medical establishment, within the legal establishment, etc. So we're going to see the same thing with COVID-19. I think I'm not the only one to say this, that it is already disproportionately affecting communities that are more at risk, people who live in dense populations, people who live in small apartments with extended families, people who are on fixed or small incomes, people who don't have a greater level to access to healthcare or access to healthcare, a greater level of access to diet and food that would promote greater health. And so our response to the current epidemic is going to have to also deal with the inequities in the ways that the virus is spreading, not only nationally, but internationally. That said, I think you wanted to address the issue of analogy. I think analogies are useful and limited. So it's really important to look at AIDS activism and the HIV epidemic for all the models that we innovated and the models that we drew on, because we were very much interested in the feminist health movement and the movement of the Black Panthers, the 10-point program, lesbian and gay health movements. Again, the feminist health movement was really a major animator of our thinking at that time. And so the movement that we didn't invent entirely whole cloth our response to the epidemic. We had reading groups, we had study groups, we were looking at the liberation movements of the 70s. I myself was very in the sectarian politics of the left at that time. We're really essentialist, and we're not really interested in feminism, anti-racist work. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to sound.
Greg, I can hear every word you're saying, and there's been like 2 times when the internet has cut out. So I just really want to make sure I'm getting every word you're saying because it's so deeply useful. So actually, Elena just messaged you a phone number that you can call in. That maybe you can set your video to mute and then call in on that number if possible, just so we can make sure to hear you. We've been able to make out everything you're saying so far.
Thanks. Sorry for I apologize for the internet.
No, sorry. We'll blame it, like we'll blame everything on capitalism and the private internet that should be free to all people. And one of the many things that this epidemic is exacerbating is all the ways in which technology is not what it should be for all of us. But so just let me know when you are able to call in. And maybe I'll take this moment to share a little piece of good news, which is that on this call, which has only been 40 minutes long, if everybody follows through on their commitments to donation, we've raised $1,500 to bail somebody out of Rikers, just with us. So I just want to say thank you to everybody. I know we're all struggling right now in different ways under the impact of this. Elena just put into the chat, if anyone still wants to chip in, there's a PayPal link, a credit card link, and a Venmo link. So like Gregg was saying, the rates of infection of COVID-19 within prisons, jails, and detention centers is far higher than everywhere else. And the already lack of healthcare, the impossibility of social distancing, which I think we're also going to see very similarly in places like Gaza. So Gregg, are you with us? Oh,
I am. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Okay, fabulous. Thank you so much for rolling with us, and we can hear everything you're saying. And let's continue on in this conversation about analogy.
Yes. So analogies are useful and they're not useful. The analogy here falls short of the specificity of the epidemic. The virus is transmitted very differently. It's much easier to get COVID-19 than it is to get HIV. You have to have blood-to-blood contact, so fluid-to-fluid contact. As far as they know, COVID-19 is spread through droplets. We are social distancing now. We can't provide the kinds of intimate physical care that we were giving to each other in our communities around the HIV epidemic. And that's a really enormous challenge. And also that means, how do we organize? You can't have a large demonstration. So there are a lot of strategies being pursued successfully by JVP and other groups to organize on a mass level and use the tools that are available to us. Early on, and to give an example about analogies, in the AIDS activist movement, early on used the Holocaust as an analogy, which this is really Larry Kramer, who wrote a book called, I think, Notes from the Holocaust, are, I think that's the title of his essays. Anyway, often made the analogy, and that really didn't work for me and a lot of other people because it kind of did damage to the history of the Holocaust and didn't do much for illuminating or understanding the specificity of the Holocaust, and it didn't do much for understanding what we needed to do. There were reasons to think about the Holocaust. There was, concentration camps and quarantine were real policy options for the Reagan administration on the front page of the New York Times every day during the 1980s. I think ACT UP's first big win was avoiding mandatory quarantine and mandatory HIV testing. Mandatory HIV testing still existed in the government sector, in the military, but it didn't expand out into the wider field of society. And the fact that we achieved anonymous testing to protect people from things that I witnessed, people getting kicked out of their homes, people being refused service at restaurants, nurses leaving meals outside the hospital rooms of people who are sick with HIV, cops wearing not medical gloves, but yellow dishwashing gloves at protests, and actually genuinely fearing us. You have to remember that there was a moment before the virus was identified where no one really knew how HIV was transmitted. And it's very important to recognize that it was the gay community that figured out safer sex, that the first safer sex information was developed by gay men and a doctor, Dr. Joseph Sonnabend and Michael Callan and a couple of other people who looked at the science and looked what was there and figured out that this was probably a sexually transmitted disease and came up with the guidelines for condom use and not exchanging body fluids. Then the CDC came along and started doing education. So it really had to come out of the community. And it came out of an ethos of community-minded health, community-minded care, doing it for ourselves, because we were abandoned. We had a great chant, by the way, for cops who wore yellow dishwashing gloves. Your gloves don't match your shoes. We thought it was funny.
Yeah, no, me too. Me too. That's a good one.
Really, it's a really tough room to play to.
It's just one person. Yeah, right. You mean the cops is the tough room, or
the cops? They were a very tough room, but no, I was talking about
right, totally, just one unmuted person, right? But I mean, I think what you're, I think so many things in what you're saying. There's a lot of laughter in the chat room. Just so you know, it's getting a lot of laughs. So I think this ethos and this lineage of mutual aid and collective care that you're talking about, that, like you're saying, ACT UP didn't invent, but really drew on the long history of serve the people. And, you know, the Black Panther Party, the breakfast programs, and the sickle cell anemia testing, and all the way to the feminist health movement. And that if the government is abandoning you, you have to do it yourself. And you talked about earlier, this binary, this false binary between services and organizing, that if you're in a crisis, that's not a real binary, that you, of course, have to do both. And right now, what's so inspiring to see is all the ways in which people are ingeniously figuring out what does mutual aid look like under social distancing, you know, about groceries, about bailing people out of jail, you know, thinking about all just how quickly the terrain has shifted, and yet this lineage of mutual aid and collective care that ACT UP has long inspired so many of us about feels very much alive and well.
It is certainly among the frontline healthcare workers, the people who are showing up to essential jobs. In my temple, Kolot Chayenu, there's a committee, Gimilut Hasadim, which visits the sick in this time of crisis. That committee is functioning and bringing food and what other people need who are stuck at home with safe social distancing, and that is what people can do, and people are stepping up. And that is activism. I guess that was just, I wanted to go back before that. I always felt like, and we organized this way, as a person who did organize mass demonstrations and was a civil disobedience trainer who was trained by the American Friends Service Committee and the War Resisters League. I mean, we had so many activist affiliations that we were part of. It truly was a coalition. But I felt like, you know, again, like the chefs who volunteered to cook lunch for people with AIDS, the people who sat down with people and listened to our issues, all of it. You know, it was a period when I was really sick, where I looked sick, and I wouldn't leave the neighborhood because you could see the fear. You know, so if I went to a restaurant in Chelsea, or went to get my hair cut in Chelsea, or just like went to the grocery store, you know, there were people who were not afraid of me, not visibly afraid of me. And this is what I fear, actually, also at this moment, is that all kinds of perceptions. There's a grocer in my neighborhood run by an Asian family, and hardly anyone goes in there because of racism, because of the association. People look to protect themselves by identifying groups that they can disidentify with. and keep distance. And so that's what one of the horrible aspects of the current situation that we're in, is that distance is necessary, but at the same time, a kind of violent social distance is also emerging, where groups are going to be targeted, where groups are already being targeted.
Right. And certainly that rhetoric is coming from the top down, right, in terms of the anti-Asian racism that's being mobilized. You know, I wanted to kind of and you know, in the chat, like, that of course this entire notion that there's no separation between the personal and the collective, you know, is exactly the influence of the feminist health movement and so much of feminism, right? So we just want to, like, acknowledge that all of these lineages are all in this stream and informing one another. And Gregg, I just wonder, this is slightly a different, you were beginning to talk about it, but I wonder if you might talk about, as a long-term survivor, like, what is it like now? And there are other long-term survivors who are alive now. What is it like to now be alive during the beginning of another pandemic?
I woke up the other night, kind of out of a nightmare that I can't remember or something. I truly didn't know what decade it was. Is it the 80s? Is it now? Lots of people with AIDS that I've spoke with, long-term survivors, and long-term survivors includes people who are HIV negative, but who passed through that horrible period, who lost so many people, who cared for so many people. Yes, I've had HIV more than half my life. You know, I tested positive when I was 23, I'm 55. But long-term survivors is a generation or more, and AIDS is not over. So, but there was a group of people who passed through the worst moments in New York with me, who are still alive and who I talk to. And we're feeling rage, that government inaction and is still very much a problem we're facing. The lack of access that I was talking about before, the way in which certain groups are demonized and ostracized. We're also, I should speak for myself. I don't want to say we, but and I know I'm not alone in this though. I've also been kind of angry, I've been angry at the lack of a general acknowledgement of the HIV epidemic and the legacy of HIV activism. The touchstones in the general imagination that's represented in newspapers and the reports I'm hearing is like, this is our Pearl Harbor, this is World War II, this is our Vietnam. I don't really hear very many people saying, well, actually there was a terrible global epidemic that disproportionately affected many people in this country. You know, I feel weird saying this, but I'm going to be honest, and I'll pretend I'm talking to you. Like, it's a conversation. You mean conversation between me and you?
It's in the lockbox.
And you know, Ronald Reagan didn't say the word AIDS until his second term. By that time, more people in the United States, had died of HIV than American service people who fought in Vietnam. You know, all loss is a tragedy, but the lack of recognition of the enormous toll of death that the HIV epidemic had on people in this country and around the world is very, very upsetting. Even before the pandemic, a lot of us are feeling like that the model we produce, the legacy, the there's a lack of witness of the catastrophe that we lived through that is not really mentioned or historicized. And that's why, to go back to the beginning of this conversation, that there's still 36 million people around the world with HIV, and only half are getting drugs, and less because there's no funding. And you can't get PrEP in the southern part of this country. You can't get prophylactic HIV medication to prevent yourself from becoming HIV negative because of disproportionate economies and poverty. There's epidemic numbers of HIV in Atlanta. Epidemic numbers now. And AIDS is not the only issue. I'm not saying that AIDS is the only issue. For me, in going forward with my work and the art I make and a lot of the writing that I do is about understanding how the HIV epidemic is now also emblematic of the way in which catastrophe that disproportionately affects the most ostracized is erased, forgotten, not made part of the public memory. And yeah, I don't know. I get lost after that. Sorry, I got a little.
No, sorry. I just appreciate your also sharing your anger and your rage with us. And
it's not you.
No, I'm not.
No one on this Zoom.
It's not taking it personal. But I just, we're getting comments here, just appreciating, and just the righteous rage of both the systemic murder of people and also the erasure of that murder, and the erasure of the resilience and survival and militant activism is absolutely mind-bogglingly enraging. And so I just appreciate your sharing it with us, and invite all of us on this call to be students of the HIV and AIDS epidemic and current ongoingly, and also of activism, to be less and less carrying forward that erasure, less and less carrying forward the whitewashing of AIDS activism, the erasure of women in AIDS activism, trans people in AIDS activism, and of course, if we really contend with the history of ACT UP, part of the reason why it's so seductive to erase is because ACT UP was calling into question everything, and it's convenient to erase certain parts of our political histories, like in the ways in which people often did to Martin Luther King, to sort of erase the more militant anti-war. Why is there funding for war and not funding for AIDS research and a cure? So just appreciate your sharing your rage.
Thank you. I was thinking that we are going to face, or are facing, a number of issues ahead of us. We're facing it now because there's a lack of ventilators, there's a lack of basic equipment to meet the demands of the current epidemic. Who gets access to those life-saving treatments is very important. Who's going to get access to whatever treatments are developed for this? It's very important to me also to go back to AIDS activism. The current historicization of AIDS is very disturbing. The movies, the few movies that do circulate, the few articles, some of the many books, there are many books that are actually now going against the grain, but there was, for a few years ago, there was this trend to really historicize AIDS activism and speak a lie. AIDS is not now, nor was it ever, only a gay white man's disease. And the historicization and valorization of that storyline is a great violence to the history of AIDS activism and to the current state of the AIDS crisis at this moment. There was a good article in the Washington Post, which there were interviews of elders, LGBTQ elders living in SAGE, affordable assisted living. In SAGE is an organization that has existed since the 70s to provide support to LGBTQ elders. And that was a really good article. That was actually really affirming, and it pointed out a number of things that as AIDS activists, we also dealt with how to have both mourning and militancy, as my dear friend Douglas Crimp, your dear friend Douglas Crimp, our friend Douglas Crimp, spoke about in an essay called Mourning and Militancy, which went against the grain of a kind of macho labor politics. Don't organize, don't mourn, organize, which was a kind of a principle, a chant, an ideal of a kind of macho ideal of like, don't mourn, organize. We had to figure out how to mourn and organize, to mourn and function, to make space for mourning, to recognize that we are all at different places. In the same ways that we also had to make space for everyone to be active, because people are more or less vulnerable in the judicial system if you get arrested. So if you are organizing civil disobedience, ACT UP was amazing because we took on the issue of privilege. We didn't guilt people about privilege. We actually, let's use this, right? I was a perfect example of that. I got arrested for handing out clean hypodermic needles on Delancey Street. I was in court for a year, and I was privileged because I worked for the Gay Men's Health Crisis, and they paid me for the days that I was in jail and the days that I was in court. I could use that. There were a lot of people who couldn't. So when we were honest about that. And I think it's really important in general as a principle to recognize that activist organizations are can be made up of many different people with many different accesses to resources that can be shared. Difference has to be acknowledged. Difference has to be embraced. And also privilege and vulnerabilities. Creating the possibility and potential for everyone to participate where they are, how they show up, how they can show up. Create as many possibilities for how many people can just show up and do something.
Right. Right.
I could just, me, Morgan, I could just keep talking. So,
no, I have more questions.
I can also ask you a question.
No, well, hey, first of all, I just want to say, and I think this piece around encouraging everyone to participate in ways that make sense for them, for all of us, is also a gift and a contribution of the disability justice movement, which of course is inextricably linked to the AIDS activist movement. And I think all of us right now are thinking about what does it mean in our organizing to organize, which has always been the case, that of our different abilities and different health statuses, when some of us are very sick and some of us are not. And I think this piece around mourning, I want to just pick up on what you're talking about mourning, and Douglas Crimp's brilliant, one of his many brilliant contributions to our collective understanding of how to live it amidst an ongoing crisis, and even have pleasure amidst an ongoing crisis. This piece around that mourning and militancy belong together, and I think one of the realities that we're wrestling with right now is not being able to gather with people as they die, and both in the process of dying and then in terms of being able to gather for funerals in person. And I know our Rabbi Kalot Hayenu, Rabbi Miriam is on this call. Rabbi Miriam, we're so grateful to you, and already our communities are pivoting to understand how do we have Zoom Zoom funerals? How do we convene virtually to still do the work of mourning in the way that we also won't let our actions, like we're still coming together to learn, to take action, and we have to adapt to the conditions. But I just wonder if you can talk more about how you all did and continue to make space for mourning, for profound mourning alongside ongoing and as part of ongoing organizing.
We gave each other space. It was very personal. I think Jean Carlomusto, who was my creative partner, my boss, my friend, my comrade, we made videos for the gay men's health crisis. I don't think I came in one day on time to work. I mean, during those days, I didn't sleep, and was really anxious, and we just made this space for us and ourselves that was really understanding, and allowed each other our feelings. We organized our own support groups. I was part of a self-organized support group of 7 gay and 1 bisexual man, that was me, who met every 2 weeks. We rotated dinners. Whoever's turn cooked dinner, ordered pizza, whatever. There were some good cooks and not some good cooks. And but we met every 2 weeks for 7 years, and we went around. It was totally self-organized, no facilitator. None of us had mental health training. We just knew from our civil disobedience training that it was just you went around in a circle, you allowed someone to go on as long as they wanted and needed, and everyone got a chance to speak. And we did that for each other for 7-8 years. There was a lot of self-organizing, and we made a lot of space for that. It was strange. It's strange now to be talking talking to you. I love you. We're good friends. You're 20 years younger than me. It's like in some ways, I forget that, and sometimes I always remember that it's really hard to describe in some ways the kinds of experiences and spaces that we made for ourselves at a different time. There were gay community newspapers, the Gay Community News out of Boston. It was a radical newspaper. There are organs and venues for those kinds of views again, but there was a different ethos. I don't know if it is the same or not the same. I got lost in thought. That happens to me sometimes when I think about the 80s, although I'll be thinking about the 80s for the rest of my life. This is the thing I was going to say. It was really difficult to be a person in their 20s.
Yeah.
Because AIDS was my youth. And learning how to have a pleasurable life, how to have sex in an epidemic, how to proceed, and thinking that you could die. I almost did die in the early 90s. I don't know why I'm alive. I think it's luck. For me, it's very important to recognize that it was who survived and who didn't. It had to do with the unique way in which sicknesses play out in individual bodies. And I was just lucky enough to hang on till 1996, and lucky enough to have access to the latest drugs. A lot of my friends didn't. But we had a youth. We went out dancing. We went out and made love lives for ourselves, sex lives for ourselves, community for ourselves, and that's how we got by.
Thank you, Gregg, and I just want to appreciate you, the labor of reaching across that 20 years, to which I think many of us can relate to in different ways, but I appreciate you reaching across what the profound and continuing that we must speak and unspeakable loss, and what it meant to spend your 20s there. So I also appreciate your reaching across that 20 years, because I know at JVP we hold this kind of intergenerational, that our work is only as strong as our intergenerational conversations and alliance. So I really appreciate you. I wanted to do two things here. I wanted to actually read a few of your words, if that's okay with you.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, just to kind of so I want to give so we're going to return to we're going to return to talk. Excuse me. Sorry. A lot of emotions. Really grateful for this conversation, Greg. So gonna read something you wrote that Douglas Crimp asked you to write for the journal that he was editing, October, and that you wrote it in. You published this piece called "Picture a Coalition" in 1988. I just want to read it, and again. So just going to read the last page of this piece you wrote. And you said, "Picture a coalition of people refusing to be victims." And I just want us to imagine, because we can't gather in person right now, to imagine our imagination, to imagine this as an invocation of our imaginations, in the way that ACT UP imagined, out of urgency and out of necessity, a way through. And we're going to talk about that language that you use of passing through, as we turn to talking about Passover in a moment. But let this be an invocation for our imagination. So picture a coalition of people refusing to be victims. Picture a coalition of people distributing condoms and clean works. Picture a coalition of people having safe sex and shooting up with clean works. Picture a coalition of people staging a die-in in front of City Hall or the White House until massive funds for AIDS are released. Picture a coalition of people getting arrested for blocking traffic during rush hour as they stand in the middle of Times Square kissing one another. Picture a coalition of people occupying abandoned buildings, demanding that they be made into hospices for people living with AIDS. Picture a coalition of people chanting "money for AIDS, not war," as they surround and quarantine the Pentagon. The government and the medical establishment denounce as immoral the people who get sick and the people they hope will get sick. The people they hope will get sick. They worry about themselves, their children, and the innocent victims. They predict the kind of people who get AIDS, the number of people infected, the numbers of death that will occur, but they are doing next to nothing to cure the sick and prevent the spread of AIDS. People are asking, if they won't do anything now, when will they? If they won't do anything for those who are sick now, for whom will they? And this is the last three lines, which feel like a kind of prayer or almost a spell. Getting no answers, people are mobilizing. Getting no answers, a movement is emerging. Picture a coalition of people who will end this epidemic. So just wanted to share those words into this space and encourage people to to read them, to get many of all of Gregg's books, but particularly this is from his anthology, The AIDS Crisis is Ridiculous. So Gregg, I didn't ask you if I could read those words necessarily, but anything you want to say about what does it mean to be hearing those words? Or how does it feel to hear those words right now? And then I'm going to ask you some questions about Passover.
I'm a little bit speechless. I'm honored that you read those words. We ended up actually doing a lot of those things. We never surrounded the Pentagon, but the Yippies did. wow. I'm trying to connect with the 23-year-old person who wrote that. I guess he's still here. I'm really at a loss for words.
You've given us, yeah.
I do want to say something about coalitions in art, though. AIDS activist artists came up with a really, I think, important idea. So the dominant media is interested in demographics and niche markets more and more, actually. And we realized, borrowing from a lot of models, that the most radical thing that art could do was to create the opportunity for groups of people to gather who never understood themselves or hadn't understood themselves as a coalition. So the first videotape I worked on with a collective called the Testing the Limits Collective was 6 of us. We went around to all the boroughs and documented what was going on in Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, New York, Staten Island, and then got the people together who are doing different actions in the boroughs to watch the documentary. The idea was like to get all those people in the room and see themselves in the space of a hard cut. Sorry to get very formal here, but I've always been very interested as a video maker and a filmmaker in hard cuts, no dissolves, unless you're implicating a passage of time. That's a little bit too nerdy for this. But, hard cuts, and just the jump cut as a way to show how a prismatic way of how we're all working and can be captured within the same frame, can be pictured within the same frame. That's the whole logic of this notion of picturing a coalition. And the most radical thing is that you can create constituencies, not demographics, and new audiences, novel audiences, people who don't imagine themselves to be in the same room together. And this, I guess, applies to Zoom as well. It can.
Yeah. It reminds me of the quote from one of the lines from your 1993 film, Fast Trip, Long Drop. When you make this speech, you record yourself making this political speech, and these films are online. I encourage everyone to watch Gregg's incredible film work. You make a speech in which you say, which continues to be my favorite political invitation, I seek a candidacy for a constituency of the burnt out, the brokenhearted, and you all of you, the profoundly confused. And I just love that as a kind of invitation to a coalition that very much we need and are made possible by and must build right now. Gregg, I wonder if you use this language. This is my using what you said to get to a question I want to ask you, which is, you said those of us who passed through that time, mm-hmm. and we are now on the eve of Passover, mm-hmm. and so much for us to discuss about. So many questions for you about about Passover as a kind of resource spiritually, also to the liberation seders that you all organized in that moment of the AIDS crisis, and so just want to open it up, just see what are you thinking about Passover, Gregg? Just basically.
Well, quickly, past and present. It's just a kind of history that I think should be documented or written about. That hasn't really been documented. Me and my friend Alexis Danzig, who was a fellow ACT member and a dear friend, and we decided we would do a queer Seder, the queer ACT UP Seder. And so we ended up with like 30 people in her railroad apartment, and somehow we got enough tables. So like it went through all the rooms of her railroad apartment, the 3, railroad, like 3 rooms. And then we decided to do it the next year, and it like almost like doubled the number to like 60 or something like that. And by that time, I was living in a communal loft in Tribeca, and then the next year we tried to, and we did it and we had like 90 to 100 people in this enormous loft where 6 people lived communally, and it was amazing. It was great. It was it got to be a little bit too much. You know, matzo balls for 100 is hard to pull off, but we did it. We did it. Like, everyone ate well, and we had our many different Haggadahs around, and you know, people were sharing stories, and our favorite was this a purple lesbian feminist Berkeley Haggadah from the 70s. I don't know, if I was in a room, I would like ask how many people, like, raise your hands, like, how many people know the lesbian feminist Berkeley Haggadah. That was like ours of choice. But we were really into interpretation. We were into study. Study was an incredibly important part of our culture. We had book groups. We were constantly, voraciously reading what became available: primary gay liberation documents, primary civil rights documents, Black liberation documents, the history of Star. I mean, all of these things were just beginning to be historicized, and that first wave of lesbian and gay liberation history, queer liberation history, was beginning to be documented. So we had these 3 years of queer seders, then Alexis and I said we couldn't do it again. But there was 3 golden years of enormous ACT UP queer seders, which got reduplicated in smaller numbers and reminded me of a lot of seders since. When you mention Passover now, and thinking about Passover from a theological perspective that connects with a liberation perspective, if you want to call it a kind of like liberation theologist perspective or liberation theology perspective, you can think of Passover and the plagues, and I'm going to talk about that. But actually, in 2 weeks, on Shabbos, on Sabbath, April 25th, there are 2 Torah portions that are read in the annual cycle. You all know there's like a worldwide reading group of the Torah, and we all read the same portion every week, and you read it wherever you are, whenever you are. Important, actually, one point to make: the Abram Joshua Heschel said that Judaism exists in time, not space. Friday night, it's Erev Shabbos. Friday night happens everywhere at a different time. You enter the Sabbath at a different time, but everyone enters on Friday night. In this way, Judaism exists in time. It's a diasporic configuration. And Passover is the same. The Jewish holidays are the same. In 2 weeks, there's 2 portions in Leviticus, which is not people's favorite book. But I think it's utterly fascinating book. And so we'll read Tazria and Mitzorah, which are about the diagnosis of skin diseases and afflictions, and cleaning infected houses. So in biblical times, not doctors, but the high priests were called upon to diagnose many afflictions, skin afflictions among them. I'm using the word affliction specifically because it's a debate, but the word that's used in the Torah, the Hebrew word tazria or zarat, was kind of wrongly translated as leprosy. Actually, the skin afflictions that are described and the cures for them are not in any way consonant with our contemporary ideas of social distance or quarantine or transmission. And the cure for these things was largely sacrificial and ritual. But contemporary Jews think about afflictions in terms of how the body and spirit are affected by illness. There's one set of commentaries which are about how afflictions are caused by being guilty of sin. But this is a contested idea in religion. I suffered greatly in the 80s and 90s because I was told by people of many faiths that my HIV infection was caused by the sin of my homosexuality. This is the dominance of the Christian right. But actually, I heard that in the Jewish community, and not just the Orthodox Jewish community, so-called progressive Jews. And so I think there's another way of thinking about that, which is that when you're ill, it's both a profoundly difficult place for the body to inhabit, but it's also spiritually painful. How do you blame yourself for illness? What kind of blames do you take on? Illnesses are accidents. They're not caused by an intervention. They're not punishments that are meted out. It's statistical probabilities. Why I survived is an accident. I didn't do anything different than my friends. We all tried to survive. So, in thinking about the afflictions in the context of the Torah, I think in 2 weeks when we read Tazria and Metzora, or at the Passover Seder, when we name the 10 plagues, we should think about the spiritual and psychological dimension of suffering. It's very, in the Seder actually, it's pointed out that we don't celebrate the deaths of the Pharaoh's army at the Passover Seder. That's principle. So you all know JVP, Jewish Voices for Peace. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. You dip a pinky or a knife or a spoon in the wine, and you name all 10 plagues, and you put drops on their plate, and you're not supposed to lick your pinky or your knife or your spoon. You don't enjoy the wine that represents the blood spilled. You don't celebrate death. You do take the opportunity to be grateful wherever you are. That's what you before this conversation, you asked me a question, and I think we're going to get to it, but this question's been in my head since you put it into my head last night or this morning, was like, what gives you strength and fortitude at this moment? And I have to say, it's gratitude. It's an awful time. I'm sheltering in place. I'm very grateful to be sheltering in place with my partner and Christine and our dog Babka. And I'm grateful for the sun. I'm grateful for breathing. Gratitude gets me by. On a practical level, rituals, waking up every morning, praying, meditating every day, exercising, setting the clock. These are just things that we've all talked about, but just this kind of everyday ritual practices, returns, cyclical returns on a daily basis is very helpful to me. And lastly, to bring it back to the conversation about AIDS activism, I believe two things, and I think that these are two things that you have to believe if you're an activist. One, life is worth living, and two, the possibility for change exists. These two beliefs are fundamental to being an activist. That's what keeps me going. I believe that life is worth living and the possibility for change exists.
Thank you, Gregg. First, one question: is the Berkeley Lesbian Feminist Haggadah, is that the one by Judith Stein, or is that a different one?
I am embarrassed to admit I don't have it in front of me.
Okay, we'll figure it out. Our collective.
It's purple. It has an illustration of grapes on the front. You all know it.
Everybody, it's purple. Okay. Just want to invite a few folks to just put a few questions in the chat box. We're going to start to move towards closing in a few moments, and so just want to invite a few questions from you all.
Wow.
You got him speechless, Gregg. Everyone's speechless. Oh yeah, the question of, and oh yeah, so these are good. So we're getting a couple questions. Do you see them all in the chat box? Maybe I'll just let you choose. I just remind you, no pressure to answer any of them. So really just choose the questions that feel generative for you to reflect on.
I think I addressed the question about, there's a question about, well, there's a question, did they already answer the question about you seeing Dr. Fauci on television? No, but that is one of the reasons why I wake up in the middle of the night and don't know what decade I'm in, because all of a sudden I'm watching the news. I don't even watch television anymore. It's this laptop. And there's actually a well-preserved, handsome Anthony Fauci standing next to another schmuck Republican president, wondering like, how is this possible? And at the same time, I'm really grateful to Fauci. I used to be really angry at Fauci, and he just gave an interview again for the Washington Post. I've narrowed my news. I'm on a news diet because it's hard to take, and so I just picked one stream. And so I read the Washington Post a lot. And there was an interview that Dr. Fauci gave to the Washington Post where he admits that he learned from AIDS activists. Because we were banging in his door in the 80s. And Larry Kramer went toe to toe with Dr. Fauci on the nightly news. And Fauci invited AIDS activists in. Fauci met with ACT UP. Met with people from ACT UP and learned, what he says in this interview is that he learned that you have to include the voices of the people who are actually affected and infected with the disease. This was maybe the historical contribution of ACT UP. If you look at like the history of liberation movements and the principle of self-determination, ACT UP, building on feminist health movement and other health movements, placed people with the disease at the center of the conversation. And that was one of its most important contributions. We understood people with AIDS as a diverse coalition, but also as a people who could be configured like old class politics, like a class, like the working class, a protagonist of for the change of history. And so, yes, seeing Fauci is in some ways oddly comforting. It's very disturbing to see the way he's being treated and shut down, the way that science is being treated and being shut down. We were arguing for healthcare trials and standards and access to drugs, and and now we have a president who's hawking untested, scientific possibilities, and still shunning the responsibility of the government's that the government has to be well funded and research a cure for the virus and to get it to everyone who needs it. The government is still blocking that, even though we have people in the administration like Anthony Fauci, who actually joined forces with the AIDS activist movement and understood expanded access trials.
Right.
And so other questions.
Maybe you can answer just one more question, then we'll probably close.
I don't know if there's anything that how did my Judaism shift and change with my relationship to and would love to hear about your choice to integrate klezmer Yiddish music into your film. I think this is relevant, I guess, to Jewish Voices for Peace, because my entrance into identity politics happens very early as a child. Being Jewish was my first awareness of difference, even though I actually grew up in a very diverse working class neighborhood in Queens that was primarily Black and Jewish and Italian, Irish, Puerto Rican, and Korean. And but we understood ourselves as distinctly different, and yet were able to cope with those differences. And I was very grateful for that childhood. But Jewishness was very much part of my childhood. I grew up in a English-speaking household, and throughout my life, I've been the wandering Jew. I was bar mitzvahed in an Orthodox temple. I had my doubts. I left. For years, I was angry. My years as an AIDS activist and encountering people of faith, Jews who were homophobic, did not lead me to back to embrace aspects of Orthodoxy or Jewish religion, but turned, like a lot of people in the late 80s, to Yiddishkeit. So there was a whole bunch of us Jewish activists who were exploring anti-Zionist ways of exploring our Jewishness, which meant delving deeper into New York, delving deeper into the Lower East Side where we were in, where you could see Hebrew written on the sides of buildings, and there was still the remnants of the Lower East Side Jewish community where my grandparents were born. And so we explored Yiddishkeit, and we're fiercely proud of Judaism. Being, as far as I understand, Jewish identity is made up of three terms: the cultural, the religious, and the nationalistic. And I always strongly identified culturally with being Jewish. I am much more religiously observant than I was for many years, but not as observant as I was when I was a kid. And the national piece has always vexed me, because I embrace the diaspora. The things that are moving to me
Us too.
As a Jew. Yeah. The Jewish diaspora is a very moving and encouraging and inspiring story. And this notion that I said before, that Heschel talked about, how Judaism exists in time, not space, is
Right.
a very forceful one for me.
Right. Well, Gregg, on that note of claiming the parts of our histories that are nourishing, and continuing our resistance to nationalism and white supremacy and ethno-nationalism of all kinds, from here to Palestine, we're going to put a few things in the chat about ways for folks to stay involved. One is this phone bank on Friday from 2 to 3 p.m. where we're going to be continuing to demand that New York State free them all. And when we say free them all, we mean free them all. People in jails, prisons, and detention centers, because we do not believe in state-sanctioned murder and collective death. So we're going to free them all. So so we have a phone bank on Friday. The next thing we're going to put in the chat is we're calling on the U.S. government to demand that Israel end its blockade on Gaza. The first cases of COVID-19 have already been confirmed in Gaza, and we know as an open-air prison with 1.8 million people, with a gutted medical infrastructure because of 13 years of Israeli military blockade and an ongoing catastrophe of Israeli colonialism, the effects of COVID-19, like they are in prison, will be utterly disastrous on top of an already disaster. So we're putting in the chat an opportunity for you to join this call to end the Israeli blockade on Gaza. That's the second thing. The third thing is that all of you are invited to our JVP New York City Seder on Friday, April 10th, this Friday at 6 p.m. They cannot keep us apart, you all. They can't keep us apart. We're going to keep being together and keep reinventing and drawing on all the many liberatory rituals and traditions behind us. So please join us and bring your family and friends to our virtual Seder. We're also going to put in the chat, we really encourage you all to follow two coalitions. One is the Free Them All Coalition, which is coordinating the work to free prisoners, people in jails and detention centers. And the second is the Coalition for Housing for All, which is working on the rent suspension and suspension of all utilities, and that must happen now. So, Gregg, thank you so much for being here, for being who you are, for everything you've done, for just who you are to all of us. And we are just beyond lucky to be the beneficiaries of your work and your kindness and your generosity. I strongly encourage everyone to watch Gregg's movies, which are generously available online, to read his work, much of which is online. And when his retrospective is able to happen at PS1, MoMA PS1, when, who knows, but hopefully to please go. It's called I Want to Be Well, and to bring students and bring friends. And thank you everybody for taking this time to be here. May you have a meaningful Passover, if you're observing, meaningful Ramadan, meaningful Easter, meaningful full moon. We love you. We're in this together. Gregg, thank you so much.
I just want to thank you, Morgan, very much for having me. It was an honor to be here, and thank you to JVP. I support JVP. I read the roadmap, look at the new video. I'm in. I say yes. I endorse it all. And thank you for all the work. And thank you, Morgan. I'll see you at Seder tomorrow.
I'll see you at Seder.
Zis Pesach.
Love you all. Feel free to putting again the links in the chats. Thank you, Elena, Layla, Jay, Eliza, for all the tech support. Really appreciate it. Thank you all JVP New York City members who have been doing this work. Thank you to friends and family who tuned in, of all of us. We appreciate you. Lots of love, everybody.